Hi everyone. I'm Jeremy Lent, and I'm really glad to welcome you to today's live interactive conversation with author Marjorie Kelly, who has written several groundbreaking books, kind of showing a way forward for society. And she's currently a distinguished senior fellow with the Democracy Collaborative, an important change-making organization that I hope I'll discuss a bit later in our conversation. And Marjorie has recently come out with a new book, Wealth Supremacy, which we'll be discussing today. And as some of you know, I'm currently writing a book on the vision and possibility of an ecological civilization. And as I did my research on this, and over the last few years, really, one major insight gradually dawned on me, which is just this, that our current system actually isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was intended to do, which is to exploit people and extract resources, basically to pump wealth as efficiently as possible up to the elite at the expense of everyone else, humans and non-humans alike. And in all that research, I found very few books that pierce through all the layers of what we call like cultural hegemony that reveal the underlying operating system of wealth accumulation that drives it. And when I read Marjorie's book, which she came out recently, just last year, Wealth Supremacy, how the extractive economy and the biased roles of capitalism drive today's crises. When I read that, I knew I'd hit pay dirt, because what Marjorie shows, and what I'm looking forward to discussing with her today, with you all, is that if we want to change our civilization's trajectory, we have to transform it at the deepest level, basically all the way to capitalism's operating system. So today, we're going to be, our session is about 75 minutes long today, and Marjorie and I will spend the first half hour or so just in conversation together. And then in the second half, I invite you to join in the conversation with your reflections, questions, and perspectives. And we also have our chat there live, and you can use that collaboratively. So if there's some point that gets made, you want to think everyone should really highlight, put that in the chat. Or if you have questions and you're not comfortable being there spotlighted in the second half, ask the question in the chat. And we'll try to, I can't guarantee all, but I'll try to select some out to ask in the second half. So with that kind of intro, I'd like to say welcome, Marjorie, and great to see you. I'm so excited to have this conversation. As we were saying, you and I have interacted a little bit in the past, but have never had this opportunity for this kind of live discussion. And so glad to be able to do this with you today, Marjorie. And to begin with, you've already written some amazing books over the years, like Owning Our Future and The Divine Right of Capital. Even before you came out with this real insight into the operating system of capitalism. And I'd love it if, and I know you've mentioned it once or twice in some of your books about your own personal arc, if you could maybe take us a little bit on your own sort of arc of discovery in your own life's journey to this place of this critique of our dominant system and how that's changed over time.
Jeremy, it is so fun to be here, and I'm just thrilled to see there's a couple hundred people here. This is such an important conversation, and as you noted in your description, it's we're not talking about this enough. What is the operating system that's driving so many crises? I'm often asked, Jeremy, what is my arc? But I'm going to tell this two different ways, because I feel with you, I'm with a friend who I can talk about my deeper self. I mean, I've been reading your book, which I love, The Web of Meaning. And so, when I read your book, I think about this sort of interior journey that I've been on. I was a student of Zen. I had an awakening of feminism back in the 70s and became a lesbian, which, really was an awakening of questioning cultural norms. I mean, I think it's really enabled me to do the work I'm doing with questioning capitalist norms. So, and I'm studying now the return of the divine feminine, which and the Tao. I've just been a long time student of the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching. So that's kind of and I left Catholicism as a teenager. so this is, kind of my personal underground journey, let me say. And then my above ground journey, my career journey has been different. I come from a business family. My grandfather founded Anderson Tool and Die in Chicago. My father, ran a small business. I ran a small business. I published Business Ethics magazine for 20 years because I thought, if you want to, I wanted to make a difference in the world. I'm a boomer, right? And I thought, if you want to make a difference, business is the place to do it because that's where all the power is. And I began to see in the 80s divestment from South Africa and new kinds of talk about management. And I thought, I want to put myself in the middle of this and help these emerging progressive business people and investors help this movement grow.
Yeah.
Well, I became discouraged over time. I thought that individual business people, individual investors could change the world. And I came to see that the problems are really systemic, and that it's really not about bad people. It's about a system that is on autopilot. And I've written a number of books about this, and it's brought me to the Democracy Collaborative, where I am now. And we've done, most of my career, Jeremy, and I've been writing about progressive business and investing for over 30 years as a journalist and consultant. And I've always emphasized the positive. There's so many brilliant visionaries and theorists who figured out, how do we design an economy that's totally different? We know how to do it. It's known, but things are getting worse and not better, right? And so I got mad and I said, it's not enough to build the positive. We have to turn and discredit the core operating system that is now in charge of the planet and in charge of civilization. And that's what I'm pointing. And I think pointing to, and as a longtime meditator and Buddhist, what I suggest in the book is, let's begin by seeing. Let's see clearly the nature of what has us in its grip, and then that will guide us as we move forward.
I love that so much, what you're saying there, Marjorie. And I love the way you're connecting it with meditation and like how when we meditate, the liberation comes from being aware of the stories we tell ourselves that remain unasked. And so that's exactly what I feel you're doing. And I'm so aligned with what you're saying. I'm writing this book right now on trying to stress the positive, very much so, the vision of political civilization. But the first quarter or so of the book is actually, and that's where I'm going to be quoting your own book, and is looking at the core things that are wrong, because I feel, and this is maybe what you're talking about, is there's so many solutions, quote unquote, that people come up with, that actually what they're doing is kind of making this system just that little bit more manageable, right? So that it can maintain and perpetuate itself rather than actually shifting the system itself. Yeah, I'm curious. What do you see examples of that? Like, what would be one or two of your examples of what you might call like false solutions or whatever? And I get a little bit worried about binaries, like, a full solution, but I think you know what I'm saying. Yeah.
Well, one of them is corporate social responsibility inside companies, where they have community relations and they want to give, donations and talk about being responsible, but it never goes to, well, let's change the core purpose of the corporation, which is to maximize returns to shareholders, and let's not change who actually is on the board. Let's not change our metrics of success, but we'll talk a good game. That's one. And I hate to say it, but another one is ESG. If people know that, it's environmental, social, governance criteria for investing. Now, my wife works in the socially responsible investing field, and there are very good people in this field really trying hard to do good things. And there's a lot going on there, but a lot of it is just, we're just going to apply some very light screens to publicly traded companies. So, and most of it doesn't really amount to any kind of real change, I'm sorry to say.
No, I'm so with you on that. And this, when you're mentioning that raises a question I have for you. I'm curious how you respond to this. Like oftentimes I'll be in talks where I'll be saying similar things, and somebody who's there in the audience will put their hand up and say, well, actually I work in a company,
Mhm.
public company, but we're doing good things. It's a pharmaceutical company,
Sure.
and I'm working in this group that's, so are you saying that I'm bad because I'm working in this kind of pathological company? And it
Mhm.
doesn't feel like that to me. And I'm curious what you say to somebody who is engaging
Mhm.
and feeling like they're making maybe some progress, whatever, within that corporate sphere, and what you say to them and what you suggest to them as part of what
Yeah.
you do.
Well, I try in my book and in my work to be very non-blaming,
Hmm.
right? I mean, all of us should be completely changing our lives because of climate change, right? I should be driving an electric vehicle. I should get rid of my fossil fuel burning furnace. Have I? No, right? So none of us are blameless, and individual change is never enough. And so I I don't want to blame individuals or make people feel bad because they have to make a living inside a corporation.
Hmm.
I gave a talk not too long ago to some MBA students at a very progressive business school, and this was a course on responsible investing and so on. And I could tell that the students were visibly uncomfortable. Um, when I'm talking about the essence of the system that they're entering into, and they asked, well, what do you do? How do you make a living? And really work for deep change. And I said, first of all, you need to know how the system works. So it's worthwhile to be inside the system and understand it because you have to understand its lingo, its methods, in order to be sophisticated about changing it. So that's important. But I also invite us all to be just clear-eyed. Even if we can't make the immediate changes that we feel we would like to be able to make, let's not delude ourselves. Let's see clearly the situation that we're in. And this is true about
Right.
climate change, as well as the nature of capitalism and the nature of our own investing portfolios and where our jobs are. We can't step outside of our civilization,
Right.
really. We're all in it. But let's just begin with seeing.
Right. Right. Exactly. So let's then turn back to that seeing and and look at some of those kind of deeper questions. And I guess one question I have for you, the title of your book is Wealth Supremacy, right?
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and why maybe just for people who are new to your writing and to the book, do you want to just give a sense of what you mean by wealth supremacy?
Sure.
How you would describe that? What you're saying?
Yeah. Well, it's a deliberate echo of white supremacy, which we know is not legitimate. Of course, white supremacy is the cultural ethos that says white people are better than people of color, right? And all of the norms and practices that support that. Well, wealth supremacy is very similar. It says wealthy people matter more than everyone else, and they have, and it's very similar also to gender inequities.
Hmm.
And I learned a lot about language from feminist
Uh-huh.
theorists of language. When we used to say mankind or he was the
Yes.
generic. I mean, there were all kinds of ways that language advanced a male worldview invisibly. Well, this is true in business too, and economics and investing. For example, we say that a wealthy person has a high net worth, right? They're worth more than other people. That's what our language
Yeah.
tells us. Or the income statement, which is a lens. It's Greek to most of us, but it's just a simple lens for
Mhm.
viewing economic activity. There's money coming in, money going out, and what's left over, you get to keep and use. Well, so and every business uses an income statement. It's a universal lens. And what it says is income to capital, which is another word for wealth, is profit, and that's good. And you're supposed to have as much of it as possible.
Mhm.
Income to labor is expense, and that's bad. And you're supposed to have as little of it as possible. So
Yeah.
the very structure of the income statement and the language we use there tells us pay wealthy people as much as you can, pay workers as little as you can, and by the way, get them out of the company altogether. Um,
Yeah.
so those are examples of what what I call capital bias. And this is a second term, Jeremy. Wealth supremacy is really a large cultural construct. I mean,
Right.
who controls philanthropy, who is revered as a rock star? It's wealthy people. But how do they stay on top? How does their wealth keep growing year after year after year? How does that happen, right? Well, that happens as a result of capital bias. And capital bias is how the system, meaning corporations and investments for the most part, and ownership in general, how is that designed? Well, it's designed to favor capital over labor, over the environment, over the community. And there's very technical ways that it happens. The income statement is one. Corporate governance is another one. Who has a vote inside corporations for the board? It's only capital. Workers don't have a vote. You can work somewhere for 40 years. You can make the products. You can answer the phone. You can run the place. You have no vote. You have no claim on the wealth you create. A hedge fund manager can buy in and then 15 minutes ago, and they have a vote and they have power.
Yeah.
That's capital bias, and we just accept it as normal, and it's hidden as these are just kind of technical terms. It's just kind of the way things are, but that's where it's hidden.
Right. No, I got you. That's great way of describing that. And would you say then that is wealth supremacy the inevitable outcome of capitalism? Or, I mean, some people will talk about, well, we need to make a more moral capitalism, or we need to do a better capitalism. Are you saying that it's inevitable that capitalism leads to this kind of wealth supremacy?
Yeah, one of the things I say in my book is that moral capitalism is as impossible as moral racism. That once you recognize it's a system of bias through and through, then you need another system. You need a next system. You need a democratic economy that's designed from the ground up to benefit all of us.
Yeah.
And so, no, I don't believe moral capitalism is possible.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm in full agreement with you on that. And that's a lot of what I'm basically in my book, sort of wanting to make this argument just as you've made it so clearly. So that then people really get to see, yeah, we really need to change that operating system. And then what does that look like?
Right.
But one of the things that actually I emphasize in the early part of my book, I'm so glad that you do too, is how European imperialism and colonialism was almost like the precursor of this and kind of co-evolved with it. And I'd love to, I thought some of the best parts of the book, I thought, was where you really dug into that. And maybe you could just share a couple of those ways in which that's happened.
Sure. Yeah, that's really important, Jeremy. It's really important to understand that capitalism really grew out of imperialism. It's really a continuation of imperialism, is what it is. I read, for some reason, I'm foolish enough to subscribe to The Economist.
So do I, by the way.
And I read it, you have to decode it, right? But there was a sentence, the recent issue talks about the New World Order, and it's talking about really the breakdown of globalization. But there was a throwaway sentence in there, and it said, well, before, World War I put an end to an ideally integrated global economy. And I'm like, wow, they're talking about imperialism, where Europe controlled 85% of the land mass of the planet for the benefit of an elite in Europe. Africa was captured, the global South was governed. This was all colonialism. And so these nations were basically plantations where the wealthy of Europe, grew things and basically took the minerals and benefited the European elite at home, and America is a slightly different story, but similar. Of course, we pushed off the Native Americans and took their land. So when you recognize, and this is actually a fascinating thing, in World War I, was perceived as the end of the world. People at the time really perceived it as the end of the world. And it was the end of a world, which was the world of aristocracy and monarchy. And imperialism broke down to a certain extent. And this is where neoliberalism arose out of the breakdown of empire. so the neoliberals, these economists, were horrified by the upsurge of democracy around the world.
Right.
Nations were breaking away from their colonial masters. There was a great wave of colonial destruction, just losing all of their colonies. And yet, and here's how I like to simplify it and say, society long ago democratized government,
Mm-hmm.
but we never democratized the economy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for example, you look at South Africa and related countries. De Beers Diamonds, which trades on the New York Stock Exchange, it's a multi-billion-dollar company, still controls the mineral wealth, the diamonds out of South
Right.
Africa. So
Exactly.
that was never,
Mm-hmm.
that part was never overturned, right? Yes, you can vote your people in, that's fine, that's fine. We still own the diamonds. And so, that's an example of how imperialism, the breakdown of imperialism, politics went one way toward democracy, which now has become a virtually universal system around the world, but it's under threat because we never democratized the economy. And the economy and financial wealth has grown so large, it completely dwarfs the real economy. It dwarfs the planet, and it's in charge.
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you there. And I want to, just for clarification, to raise one point. Actually, a girlfriend just put that in the chat, and I'm breaking my normal rule, as I normally I only bring those questions in the second half, but it's so
Sure.
relevant and so key. He said, "I'm perplexed. There were many empires before Europe's, whatever, Islam, Rome, Genghis Khan, etc. Why are you saying this all began with Europe?" And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that. I think it's,
Why am I emphasizing Europe?
yeah.
Well, Great Britain
Hmm.
was the largest empire known. I
Mhm.
believe that's true, at least at that point. And it Great Britain was the birthplace of capitalism,
Right.
really. And capitalism has become a global system. It's there even in China. It's there in Russia.
Mm.
Even these cultures that are very different. It has become a global economy. Now, I'm not an expert on imperialism, so and maybe Gil is,
Um,
but
yeah. But yeah, I mean,
one of the things I say in the book, Jeremy, is that empires now are portfolios of assets.
mm,
That is where empires now reside. I mean, Bill
yeah,
Gates is the
exactly.
largest
Yeah,
landowner of agricultural land in the U.S.
exactly. No, I hear you. And but to me, I think what the key point that you hit on was that Great Britain was where capitalism began. And
Right.
and what I see is, because I think it's a really good point, that empires existed for thousands of years in different ways. But this is the first time that there was basically this worldview that arose in Europe. Of this worldview of separation, this worldview of seeing everything else as as objects to exploit or extract.
Right.
And
Right.
capitalism was the first economic system that actually was this manifestation of this worldview that was different from other worldviews, which was, and to your point, that you talk about a lot, is one of these key things when we're trying to see through, like what it was going on with this system, is this wealth maximization. There's not
Yes.
enough just to have wealth, but then to maximize it infinitely. Do you want to talk more about that? Because that seems to be
Yeah.
key element, and also a key element of the financialization that we see now.
Yes. That's right. That's right. Yeah, because of course most empire was based on control of land. These were agricultural
Right.
societies. When you controlled land, you controlled the wealth of the economy. And then with the Industrial Revolution, which began in Europe, I mean in England, wealth became factories, and then it has become intellectual assets. So but the same mindset is at work. And I talk about the myths at the heart of our economic system that really hold it together and sort of normalize it. And the first one is the myth of maximization. And that's the myth that no amount of wealth is ever enough. And I do use the example of Bill Gates, that he at one point had, I think, $30 billion, and that's a ludicrous amount of money. Hundreds and hundreds of families could create dynasties for untold years with that kind of wealth. But what did he do? He invested it. And within about a decade or two, he had $130 billion. Now, in what sense does that make sense? In what world does that make sense? And yet, investment portfolios continue creating wealth even after death, right? So it is like no amount of wealth is ever enough. And the process of wealth creation, we're told, it's actually wealth extraction in so many cases, is ideally limitless, maximum, and perpetual. It goes on forever. It's maximum, and it has no limits. I mean, that's the essence of the insanity.
Yeah, I love that. And sometimes I find a really interesting way of relating is when people talk now about AI and the danger that artificial intelligence gets programmed, and it gets it's smarter and more powerful than any human system, and it has some crazy program like maximizing the number of paper clips or whatever. And before we know it, our entire world is destroyed from that. But it's like we created that that AI in basically in global capitalism, in corporations, to always just be maximizing and maximizing at the expense of life. So, what I love is these way in which you highlight these myths, and that myth of maximization is one, and then this myth of fiduciary duty is so powerful. And you were saying before about people coming from the corporate world, really having an understanding. And part of my confession is that I spent the first part of my life in business. Actually, the company took it public. I was actually chairman and CEO of a publicly traded company. And so when I came across the way you were unraveling that myth of fiduciary duty, that really struck home to me how important that is. And there's one sentence you say in your book, which I just want to quote out loud, and then I'm going to ask you to talk about a little bit more. In fact, that's one that I'm quoting in the book I'm writing right now. How if every single tech billionaire, hedge fund manager, and CEO were abducted by aliens tonight, the system would barely notice. It would reconstitute itself with nary a ripple. Love that. And the same would be true for board directors, so what is that? What is this system of fiduciary duty that is so invisible, but so powerful?
Right. And, it's very hard for us to get that that no one is in control of the system. Right. It's a mindset. What's in control is the mindset. Right. And maximization is the core element of that. Fiduciary duty is how it's kind of the alibi for the system. I mean, it sounds so technical, it's so benign, it's so necessary and positive. Who could question fiduciary duty? You sound like a crazy person, right? So like, if you had some money to invest, Jeremy, and you gave it to me, I have a fiduciary duty to act in your interest. Right? I can't go off and invest in my crazy uncle's business. I can't spend it on going to the Bahamas, right? I have to manage that money on your behalf. That is my fiduciary duty as an investment manager. And we say the same thing of corporations, because we think of corporations as objects owned by shareholders. We don't think of them as human communities, which they are. But so let's come back to just investment. So fiduciary duty in this is taught as, you have, if you're a board member or if you're an investment manager, you have a duty of loyalty, a duty of care. And those are real, right? I have to be loyal to you. It's your money. I have a duty of care. I have to pay attention. I have to read things. I have to attend meetings. I can't just like be asleep at the switch and let shenanigans go on. So that part of fiduciary duty is real and it's necessary. But there's this other part that's invisibly hidden in there. And what it says is returns to capital matter, nothing else matters,
Mhm.
right? So basically, in giving me your money, Jeremy, I have license to destroy the world on your behalf. You know, I can throw workers out of work. I can trash the Amazon. I can, you know, capture government, whatever. It's my fiduciary duty to maximize returns to my investors. Everything else is irrelevant. And that's another bit of craziness, because of course that's exactly what's happening. And so when we think about ExxonMobil, for example, it's easy to think of ExxonMobil as a bad guy, and the CEO is the bad guy, and he refuses to act for climate change. But what that company is doing really is following the basic norms of corporate governance. He's acting to maximize returns for shareholders and ignoring everything else, including the survivability of the planet. I mean, that's kind of like the poster child for the absurdity of
Yeah.
shareholder primacy and the fallacy of fiduciary duty. He has license to destroy the planet in order to create gains for his shareholders. And so Exxon's price, its share price was up, I think, 80% last year. And that was when, of course, you know, fires were burning in forests. New York City was flooding. But Exxon was doing what the system tells it it's supposed to do.
And you even quote somebody talking about it as a sacred trust. So these people, so to them, what is sacred is not actually the living earth or love, or it's
Right.
like sacred trust is for wealth to maximize itself.
Yeah, and it's really important to recognize this is not about bad people. And this is, you know, so you know, you quoted, if all the board members were abducted by aliens tomorrow, that the system would barely notice. So, you know, if you're on the board of a pension fund, or you know, a big asset manager firm, what they see is numbers, right? Do the numbers go up this quarter? Did they go up enough? Do they need to go up more? That's what they see, and they feel they have a duty to make sure those numbers keep going up. Nothing else shows up. The forests burning don't show up in that investor statement. So this is one of the ways that that the system is on autopilot.
So if we have this incredible, powerful system, which is basically, like you say, it's almost like an invisible gas that hypnotizes people. And what we're trying to do is like break the trance, right? So what are the ways? Like you've also written, I love the last part of your book, which talked about different ways we can actually break that trance. And why don't you tell us what are some of the first things that come to your mind for how we can break that?
Well, I think the first thing that we do is we talk to each other like this. Right. And this, again, this reminds me so much of feminists in the 70s. I mean, you have to recognize how pervasive the bias is that's working against us. And it's in us as well as everyone else. So talking to each other, seeing clearly, I think that's the first thing that it was Donella Meadows who said, you know, where do you intervene to change the system? Well, she said the highest point of leverage is mindset, the mindset out of which the system arises. And so this is where we stop participating, right? So I think that's the first thing. You know, we need pranks. You know, I read about some friends of mine who said, let's buy Twitter and turn it into a social enterprise or a co-op. Now, of course, that was long before it was taken over by Elon Musk, and it's kind of a done deal now. But it started an interesting conversation. Oh, you know, really, isn't this really like a public forum? Shouldn't it be owned by the people who are on the platform? And there is a movement for platform cooperatives. There's a taxi service, kind of like an Uber in New York City, that's owned by its own drivers, right? So this idea that we can own these things, just to raise that idea, that's it helps us to break the mindset of well, of course the wealthy own everything,
Right.
you know. No, we can own things. We don't have to take it for granted. So, you know, we work a lot on this at the Democracy Collaborative. We want to show proof of concept that another kind of economy is possible. It's not only possible, it's superior if the outcomes are something besides maximum gains to shareholders.
Yeah.
If for example, electric systems. There are a lot of electric systems in this country that are owned by us, right? Marblehead, the next town over, has a municipally owned electric company. So the people in the city own the electric company. You can actually go talk to somebody there if you want them to put up solar. You can go talk to the manager because he's local. We used to have a power plant in Salem, and a big coal plant. It was owned by Dominion, which is owned hundreds of power plants, and you couldn't get anybody on the phone. You couldn't talk to anybody. So we can own things. That's so we work a lot on what are the other models and showing people that they work.
Yeah, that's so important. And in fact, one of the examples that I know you and the Democracy Collaborative worked on is the Evergreen Cooperative, which was just incredible story. Do you want to just give us a little bit of color
Sure.
around that
Yeah.
story?
Well,
Inspiring.
my colleagues devised this term called community wealth building. And
Right.
it's an alternative model for economic development, local economic development. And it says, when we're doing development, let's create a different kind of economy as we do so. And we modeled this, first of all, in Cleveland, which is a Rust Belt city, predominantly people of color. And there are big institutions in the center of this city, Cleveland Clinic, Case Western University. We're spending billions and billions of dollars, but they were spending it all outside the community. And meanwhile, right at the doorstep of these enormous glass skyscrapers, there's a burned out community of poverty. I drove it and I visited, and whole blocks they looked like burned out, bombed out areas, right at the doorstep of these institutions. And so we helped. There was a lot that went on there. We worked a lot with the Cleveland Foundation, and many others, including the city of Cleveland. But these anchor institutions started buying more locally. They started investing more locally. They got together to do that. And one of the things that we helped them do was, well, let's help create some jobs in these neighborhoods. Let's start a work around commercial laundry. And so it set out to hire the formerly incarcerated, and it did so well. It did so well at doing a little piece of the laundry for like Cleveland Clinic that they awarded the whole contract. They took it away from big multinational that was managing their laundry, and they gave it to these worker owners. They now do all the millions of pounds of laundry for Cleveland Clinic. And there are other. Then I worked with a colleague, and we helped start. We said, well, there should be more worker-owned firms, and you need capital to do that, to step in and buy those firms from their founders. And so we helped to design the Fund for Employee Ownership, which is now run by Evergreen. And I think it's bought 5 businesses and created and transformed them into worker-owned businesses. So it's an example of you can do economic development in a different way so that the wealth stays local and is broadly shared.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for that. It's so important to actually have these examples so people can see this is not some utopian dream. It's all we need to do is to shift the orientation. And I'm keeping it aware of the time. And
yeah,
I'd love to spend the whole take the whole time talking with you, Marjorie, but I really want other people to join in the conversation. So I'm going to ask Marjorie one more question, but I invite people to start putting your hands up if there are things that you'd like to ask her, and just be part of this conversation so we can get a queue going. But the one thing I wanted to say to you too, as part of this breaking the trance, like this orienting towards a positive future, what about these massive transnational corporations? What can we do? Because oftentimes people say, but our whole world revolves around their ability to get mine here and send these things. How could we, what do we do with them?
Well, okay, so let me give 2 quick answers to that. One is corporations become big through acquisition. They don't just grow to be big; they acquire. And so so I think we need to begin looking at the acquisition process. And for example, when founders sell, let's help them sell to workers rather than selling to these big corporate acquirers, which is where a lot of companies are sold. So look at that point of acquisition. What is another exit strategy besides selling to a big company? All kinds of craft beer companies all sold to Anheuser-Busch, for example. And others became employee owned. So I would also say recognize that the behemoths of today are not the same as those of yesterday. I actually looked at the Dow Jones industrial the 100 Dow Jones 100 from, I don't know, 50 years ago, and very few of the same companies are there. So remember that there's this constant churn going on, right? And so that if we can begin to set the pathways in place, we can begin to create the next generation of enterprises. And then I would also say Elizabeth Warren, who I'm proud to call my senator here in Massachusetts, has floated a bill, I don't know, a couple of years ago, called the Accountable Capitalism Act. And she said any company over $1 billion in revenue needs to have a new federal corporate charter, state charters, or how corporations are now chartered. And they need to have a fiduciary duty to serve many stakeholders and not just stockholders. And workers need to have 40% of board seats.
Yeah, I love that. I
You know,
mean, it seems like where we need to go. It's like basically if the DNA is like we can shift the DNA of these corporations through the charters. And yeah, so one of my the things I get most excited about is the idea of a triple bottom line requirement for corporate charters, and they need to get them renewed every 5 years or so. And if they haven't met that triple bottom line of not just profit but people and planet, they don't get it renewed. And so really shift what their focus is on. So just there's so many ideas I'd love to explore with you, but let's open this up to others can ask their questions and share their ideas. And I just remind everybody, because we've already got like 12 people in the queue, to please keep your question, kind of short and snappy so that we can give space to others. And let me turn to you, Barbara. I think you're first there on the line. Welcome, Barbara. Great to see you here.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Marjorie. They're absolutely fascinating. I just wondered whether you had come across the IPET equation. Is that within your
what is the equation again?
The of humans is driven by population, affluence, and technology. Have you come across?
I don't know that one. I'm sorry, I can't comment on that. Yeah.
Talking about fiduciary duty, increasing our population, affluence, and technology had been shown by this equation to destroy our environment. So everything that I have suggested that this particular it comes from environmental science. It was developed in the 1970s. So I'm saying that actually, especially in pension plans, because the duty is to care for the person's future who is investing in the pension plan, anyone who invests in growth economics is injuring the future for the people who are investing.
Exactly. So do you have a question for?
I was just going to recommend that Marjorie familiarize herself with that. I'll pop it in the chat if you like.
Thank you.
Because
thank you. That's lovely.
It might help you to.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks, Barbara. I appreciate that. And Scott, I think you're next there, and like, good to see you. Hi.
I have to ask you to hold 1 second. Hello. I have to say, everyone, this is the most remarkable conference, and thank you so much for hosting it. My question was somewhat deeper than time may allow, but I wanted to ask Marjorie, do you believe that until we unravel Citizens United in the United States, we can have no real control over our regulations that dictate the type of corporate responsibility that you're implying? And until we have sustainable production regionally, we'll always be at the mercy and manipulation of multinationals. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because we've done work at our nonprofit to establish an economy for the rest of us, which you'll see in my chat to everyone with a link. So I'm just curious if you've given that thought.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, Scott. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, isn't there? Capture of government by corporations and by wealth is so critical, because I mean, what is it that we have in our hands that enables us to run our civilization in a reasonable way? It's democracy. It's the best thing that we as a human race have come up with for centuries, and yet we're not able to wield real democracy because of the power of wealth and of course corporations. So I absolutely agree with you. And we've got to find a way around this. And certainly Citizens United is one of the most atrocious roadblocks that we face.
Exactly. Yeah, it's such a great point. And in fact, on that, let me just bring in one of the earlier question from chat from Bob Bates. And I'll just read what he says. It's very clearly written. He said, Marjorie, in your opinion, which of the following will the entrenched power structure do? Like assuming, as we try to move towards a transition. One, voluntarily relinquish power for the common good. There's one. Two, just say they'll relinquish power for the common good, like lip service only. Or three, ride the ship all the way down to the bottom, basically. So yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question, isn't it? Well, I don't, the voluntarily relinquished power, I think will happen to some extent. I think there will be a subset of us investing differently, running companies differently. That's already happening. And so I think that will grow. I don't think that by itself will make the transformation. I do think they will say they will. I think they're already doing that. That's a lot what ESG is. That's a lot what corporate social responsibility is. It's lip service. And riding the ship all the way down, I don't know. I live with that question, I think, as we all do. What will intervene? Will it be us? Will it be crises? Will it be both? I do think that there's certainly going to be a lot of resistance, and we don't know what lies ahead. But getting together, getting clear, talking to each other, this is what we can do.
Yes, that's the great place to begin. Exactly. So let's turn to Donna, who's next there in the queue.
Hi, thanks to be here. Good to see you. First, I just want to context anything that I'm saying I'm aligned with everything that you've described there. The current trajectory is not viable for a life-affirming human civilization and living planet. And it's a humbling learning journey for all of us, and we don't have the definitive answers. There's pointing the flashlight in directions that might move us. And I think where I want to go to is around getting beyond some of the incrementalism that I think we're all concerned about, without shaming anybody that's kind of on that path. It's all going to happen anyway. It's underway. And so there are increasing numbers of us that are working on this stuff. What I want to raise is the question around new forms of incorporation, for example, and some that have actually been around for 10 years, but haven't gained the traction that they might, that are available to us now. The Fair Shares Commons. So in terms of reconstituting the commons into the fabric of society. So the Fair Shares Commons, and I'm working with Graham Boyd. We've crossed paths a little bit, Marjorie, on LinkedIn, and would love for you to have a conversation there. Because I think there's some potential for us to work at just as you've said, at the ecosystem layer, where it's a whole different perspective on ownership, where nobody owns nature. Nobody, in the investors, no one. And it really moves us towards what Indigenous peoples have always understood around taking care of, and one of the things that I think we wrestle with is not getting hung up on the labels, the language. The form of capitalism, as it's described, and even the origins of the term capitalism, have all kinds of problems. But if we get underneath and say, how do we reconstitute the commons into the fabric of society? And then the other concept with that, and I wondered whether you'd gotten into it at all, is what we've been learning about ergodicity. and how investors who already understand about pooled investment in terms of portfolios bring that down to the ecosystem layer, and that over time we actually will all benefit if we support the kinds of things that need to happen for the planet and humanity at the ecosystem layer. So stuff you're talking about around cooperatives, yeah, that's in the right direction. B Corps, yes, but nobody has been able to go far enough. They're all still fragile. So I'm sorry, there's not really a question underlying this, more of an invitation. Would be delighted to explore this because you're absolutely on the right path. Your book is excellent. And for me, it's about bridging those divides. How do we bring people together that are all working? The John Fullertons, the Graham Boyds, the Gill friends, who's here, today. Because I think we've got some of the things that will move us more in that direction. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts around that?
I'll just give a quick response. And yes, I think that your idea of reconstituting the commons and protecting it, and I don't know your particular model, but we do know that property is the base concept in our economy, and a certain idea of property, private, you extract as much as you can. And we need, yes, we can't have the wealthy owning everything. No one owns the earth, but it does need to be protected in legal form. And that's what it sounds like you're working on. So that we can leave it alone. Yes, absolutely. New forms of property, protecting the commons. That's absolutely vital. Good work. Thank you for that.
Great. And now, if I can just jump out of the queue line a little bit and turn to Mampela Ranfele, who's joining us from a late time zone, and she asked if she could speak, and she wanted to ask a question. So if we can spotlight Mampela, if you're still there, wanted to give you a chance to join in. And if
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Marjorie. I must say, your book, which I got of the ebook series, I have found absolutely riveting. And I agree with your approach. My big question is, if we equate, or you following your logic of wealth supremacy arising out of the whole colonial and imperial process, and you've made mention of my part of the world, De Beers now doesn't even play in South Africa anymore because they've finished all the diamonds. They are in Botswana. But the fact is, whatever system has brought us where we are, most of the world countries and continents, such as my own, have really a kind of triple whammy. First, we are judged by whether or not we perform well in terms of the so-called free world criteria of what is democracy, what is a good economy. And second, we can never, ever, I mean, if you are struggling in the US and other places with this wealth supremacy, spare thought for us who are simply mimicking a failed, crazy system. And so I think what people are talking about, and you are also in your book talking about the examples of re-indigenizing, literally, relocating economic activity to where people are so that we can bring in the human aspect into the economy. Because what you are describing in terms of corporate culture is to distance this madman from accountability, and it becomes a thing that no one can control. So I'm just expressing my gratitude to you and the work you're doing. And thanks to Jeremy for making sure that we have this fantastic day. But it's now late in the day and I'm traveling and I'm jet lagged. So Thank you, and we'll continue the conversation later.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for joining. It's really an honor to see you and listen to you.
Great. Thanks so much for contributing, Manpala. Really appreciate that. And yeah, and let's turn to Richard, who's been there in the queue. Hi there.
Yes. Yeah, well, thank you, Marjorie and Jeremy, for stimulating discussion, as we can see by what's going on here in comments. Also, my question is around what I see as the key dividing line for future action, whether we believe that capitalism is reformable or not. Now, Marjorie, you said that you don't believe capitalism can be a moral system. And I know in one of the blurbs I saw for your book, I don't think the reviewer quite got that, because they said you sketched out the outlines of a non-extractive capitalism. But let's assume that capitalism isn't where we want to continue and go. It would seem, therefore, that any efforts to reform capitalism is a waste of time, beyond those things that we do to give us some breathing space, making clear that we're trying to move beyond capitalism. So then what would you see as our vision for that future society? Can we call it something like democratic socialism? And if so, there is an enormous body of thought and action that can provide ideas and inspiration. This isn't a new idea, obviously. The problem is the existing capitalist regime will do all that it can to keep us from moving forward cooperatively. And the question then becomes, for all of us in practical terms, beyond just merely little reformist or individualist impulses, how far are we prepared to go to confront the capitalists and imperialists of the world? You know, what will we do? How much will we speak? Where will we put our bodies on the line? So how do you see? I mean, this is sort of an unfair question, but you must have thought about ideas of moving into that transition or that confrontation.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. We about half the book is devoted to what I call the democratic economy, and this is a concept. It's the Democracy Collaborative talks a lot about the democratic economy. I published a previous book about it, and it's an economy that's designed for all of us on a flourishing earth, and where property is widely distributed and locally held. And so I certainly think democratic socialism has got a lot right, and there's certainly a lot we can learn from it and need to keep. But from my reading of other experts in this area, democratic socialism is itself under attack by capitalism, because I think in the early days it envisioned broad worker ownership and so forth, but it got narrowed down to something more watered down. So I think that there's a lot to be learned there. And so you mentioned, so I invite you to look at the book and what I mean by a democratic economy, because there's a lot there. But you said, should we put our bodies on the line? I'm not convinced that this is a warlike effort. I think it's a shift of mind. I think it is a matter of building the positive. I think a lot of the battles are legal. I'm hoping it doesn't come to needing to put our bodies on the line.
Yeah, thanks for that, Marjorie. And if I could just add on top of that, really just to make a quick pitch for this vision of an ecological civilization, which one of the reasons I'm so excited about that, I'm writing a book on that right now, is because it gets beyond the binary of capitalism versus socialism. Like, who should own all their assets and means of production, private ownership or state? But it goes beyond that, and it looks at a different kind of civilization. Very similar wording to what you're describing, Marjorie, as a democratic economy, like actually allowing people. So the notion of subsidiarity, giving power, autonomy, and decision-making power and economic power to groups of people as far as possible, so that we have, and allowing that to then sort of fractally scale up. So from small communities all the way to mid-level things like cities, nation states, all the way to global governance. And there are different ways of approaching this. And the ideas, as you've explained so many of them in your book, they're out there already. We need to weave it together. So over to Jim for the next question.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to build on what you were just talking about. Jeremy, and also that about 30 years ago, I had this epiphany that our system is terminal. It can't work. But the system, not just capitalism, but democracy too, what we call democracy, of course, is not democracy. And so there's lots of we need tos that people are talking about, and about the individualistic mind shifts we talked about. We talked about changing the nature of corporate fiduciary nature. We talked about repealing legislation and social movements to get that to happen. But the main thing we're talking about is the underlying structure of our society. How is it possible to transform, or what I would say is to facilitate the transformation of that underlying structure? And Jeremy, you just talked about it as some of a bottom-up kind of thing. I think it's possible as a facilitator to facilitate everyone into a new state in a holistic way. And so I put some notes in the quote chart there, and we rented a booth at the last gathering of climate scientists that basically said how to get humanity to act. And we expected all the climate scientists to rush over to the booth and try and get excited about this, but they're busy, they're doing their stuff, and I can't figure out where the option is to talk to. Who do we talk to if you do have a way to transform everything? Both not only the economy, the capitalism part, but the democracy part, because we don't have a democracy. Obviously, it's collapsing right around us as we speak. So anyway, I just wanted to lay that out and hope you could comment a little bit, Marjorie.
Yeah, there's a lot that you put out there, and I appreciate that. And I want to comment on one piece. I don't think our democracy is just collapsing. I think that the hard right, fueled by dark money of billionaires, has made it a program to destroy democracy, because democracy serves all of us. And the only way that the system can keep going is to stop democracy from getting its hands on the economy and on this wealth creation machine and this wealth extraction machine. I mean, Donald Trump held a gathering not too long ago, said, with fossil fuel executives, he said, put me in office and I'll make sure that there's no regulations on the fossil fuel industry. I mean, it's not a spontaneous uprising by the working class. I mean, in fact, there was a recent book out that said that when you look at the disaffected working class, many of them have been affected by mass layoffs, right? And mass layoffs, why does that happen? Because they're companies are shifting money from labor to capital. And so this underlying shift of everything into the hands of the wealthy is driving a lot of this, but we don't see it. We're not connecting the dots. I really think the problem is the wealthy and the dark money of the wealthy. And that's, you should study Jane Mayer, Mayer. She really writes about this, that the plutocracy is what's destroying democracy.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So important. And then there's a whole other topic we should have a whole session on, is exactly that question. And I did want to know, just in terms of our next person, Suzanne Taylor, I saw Suzanne had her hand up for a while, was right there in the head of the queue, and then got lost and said in the chat she didn't mean to have her hand get lost. So if we can find Suzanne, if you want to just come in right now and ask your question.
Yes, I so appreciate that. Thank you for noticing, Jeremy. I wanted to have a whole other topic to introduce and to wonder if you deal with, which is, as you look at all these ways in which we're stuck in this democracy. And by the way, I thought I love the way you think. You express things in ways I have not heard before that made me think some more. I really appreciated all the things that you said. And as you described capitalism and how stuck we are in it and how it echoes in everything, well, of course, we can't get out. It's impossible, except how would we get out? We change the way we think. If we think of ourselves as here to help the earth rather than here to kill each other, And that's the way we should be thinking. And to me, it's like educate humanity, for heaven's sakes. We'll never get out of all this stuff without that. Do you get into that aspect of things?
Well, it certainly is what I'm trying to do with the book. I don't know if I would say I'm educating all of humanity. But what I think it's interesting, Suzanne, to think about the the innovation curve, about how do new ideas get adopted. I mean, they begin with early adopters, right? Before they become dominant and mainstream. And I think that we're very early on the innovation curve. And so I think it's really important that those of us are here together. I think we are a growing group, but I think it's still a relatively small group. And coming together and sharing ideas and developing common language and common vision, I think that's where we are. And I think that's where it begins. I don't think we're ready to educate all of humanity. I think that we need to build our movement first.
Marjorie, I can't believe how you think. My last Substack post
I think
was
I should put you. I should ask you, Suzanne, if you can yield the floor to others, because I'm seeing there are still 12 more raised hands, and we just have less than 10 minutes to go. And so,
just let me finish my sentence.
Sorry to cut you short there, Suzanne, but if we can just move to Mark and keep going. I want to make sure we have as many people get to share their views as possible.
Thank you very much. Just to say, The Divine Right of Capital, I read it a number of years ago, a fantastic book. Everybody should read it. It's one of the most important books that we've written in the last 100 years, I think. And Jeremy, fantastic, you're here as well, one of the greatest thinkers. So the two of you, fantastic. And it's fantastic, it's for free as well, and brilliant. Anyway, I wanted to say, in your latest book, Marjorie, you're talking about pranks, and you mentioned it earlier. And so I've been thinking about, for example, you say it's not personal, but there are a limited number of billionaires in the world. It's in it's in the hundreds or maybe in the thousands now, maybe 2,000 or 3,000. And I think there's a role for pranking them, for shaming them, for calling them out. For example, wealth taxation, old-fashioned taxation. For example, like we've talked about minimum income, but we don't talk about maximum income or maximum wealth. It's almost like we can't go there. So, like, if somebody shows up on television and they have $1 more than $1 less than $1 billion, maybe we could start with that. We could have a non-proliferation treaty for billionaires. In other words, that it would become almost a taboo to be a billionaire. So, I think that's where we need to get to.
I think you're right. I love that. It should be taboo to be a billionaire, and we definitely need to tax wealth. I mean, we tax our homes, right? We tax property. We should tax wealth, and I do think that culturally undermining the idea that billionaires shouldn't even exist. Absolutely, and there is a growing movement to tax wealth. And I think what we bring to it as Democracy Collaborative is we're saying, well, let's also look. That's the end point of the system. Is there's too many billionaires and they shouldn't exist. But what's the system design that drove toward that? It's a little bit like with climate change. Yes, there's forest fires. Yes, there's flooding. But what's the system that drove toward that? It's burning fossil fuels. So you need to sort of work at both ends.
Yeah, that's great. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez famously said, "Every new billionaire is a system failure."
Absolutely, I love that. I wish he'd quit, grow up, and become president.
Exactly. Susan, you want to?
Hey. So this is really interesting. I came in a little late, but this is so great. Thank you. I wanted to mention, so I was writing down notes as you guys were talking. First, I just want to mention, I am actually looking at a cooperative model. I've been talking to a couple of friends. We're trying to figure out if we can create something to bring alternative forms of packaging to market in an affordable way. That's the biggest issue that a lot of people have, like restaurants with takeout or whatever, just an alternative to petrochemical plastics. So looking at cooperatives. But as you were talking, and somebody mentioned Citizens United, the questions that came to my mind that are hard to address, but you are talking about them, is like, how do we change corporate structure or eliminate corporate personhood when so many of the politicians who make our laws are beholden to those to corporate finance, and then or how do we change campaign finance so they don't have to be beholden to that? Because we can't change corporate structure, you know, or require a triple bottom line or anything like that until we can actually liberate the people who make our laws from being beholden to these corporations. And it is one of those dog chasing its tail kind of conundrums that.
Great question, Susan. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Susan, I think it's important that we do not start by beating our head against brick walls, right? There are a lot of brick walls all around us. This is the largest, most powerful system the world has ever known. And so I think we need to look for as individuals, we need to find the place that's ours. Where do we stand here? Where do we find positive work and positive and clear seeing? I mean, I used to work to try to make major corporations more socially responsible, and you know, it's like moving battleships, right? And then I shifted over to working on more like, let's do economic development at the local level. Let's expand worker ownership, you know, and there's only 250 new worker-owned firms formed every year, right? You know, private equity is buying tens of thousands. So, right, but you know, so we have to work where we can and make the difference that we can. And what I would also say, and this might sound odd coming from me, but I do have a trust. I hold a trust that we're going to get through this, and that there is something positive ahead and it's pulling us. And we're not smart enough to know how to get from here to there. Our human brains simply, we're not going to work it out that way. But I do trust that we will find our way through.
I'll just say,
thanks for that. And Susan, I think we should move on to some other people now. And we only have a couple of minutes left, but maybe if we can just kind of do the next 5 questions, but people really keeping things to just 30 seconds or 1 minute, really quick, and so we can just get some more voices and then come to close. So Wally Hicks, hi there. But we do have to get you off mute, Wally.
Kia ora koutou from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Many of you will probably know about our world's best first equal COVID-19 response, early COVID-19 response, because now it's mid-COVID. I would like to ask, I hope this isn't a blind alley, but more of a parallel road. What do you think the part of crisis emergency regulations might play in the future of humankind?
Yeah. I think crisis is going to play a huge role, and I think that's probably implied by your question. And I think what we can hope for is that we have a kind of a series of rolling crises that allow us to respond rather than a single massive crisis. I mean, I think that the 2008 meltdown was a missed opportunity, right? I mean, the federal government owned General Motors at one point. You know, we had control of banks. We could have created public banks. You know, we could have created a new kind of social enterprise out of General Motors, but it wasn't yet there in our mind, right? This idea that new kinds of corporations, new kinds of fiduciary duty. So this is where transforming mindset really matters, so that we know what to do when the next crisis comes. I think that's the big part of our role, because they're going to come.
Great point. So true. Those are the opportunities. Crisis equals opportunity. Guy, great to have you here. Guy is a great writer on vision of ecological civilization. It's wonderful to have you join us, Guy.
Thanks, Jeremy. And hi, Marjorie. You might recall I did that review of your book in the Mint magazine.
Yes, I thank you. It's a wonderful review. Good to see you.
So very briefly, in terms of practical solutions, if we pick up the idea that the corporate charter is the core DNA of everything, and we had a proposal that every company must do a transition to a social purpose charter embodying various good things within a set period of time. If they do move to a social purpose charter, they get prior access to government contracts, lower interest rates, lower corporation tax, stuff like that. If they don't, at the end of the period, whether it's 5 or 10 years, they either lose their charter entirely, or they get refusal to government contracts, they pay a higher interest rate or stuff like that. And if they're a bank, they lose public insurance deposit, and they lose access to the Federal Reserve. So you've got a carrot and a stick. and it would transition the entire legal structure for fiduciary duty and capital maximization out of the picture and put social purpose as the primary duty of a corporation. Thoughts?
Well, I love that you're talking about this guy. You know, I've been looking at corporate governance and corporate design for decades now. Divine Right of Capital was published more than 20 years ago. And I don't know if I agree with every tiny detail you have, but
yeah.
I think that you're right. That's where the DNA is. That's the control center. Let's get our hands on it.
You yourself it can't be done voluntarily. It has to be regulatory. I'm good.
And maybe we start with certain industries.
I wanted to say, Guy, I'm going to be writing about some of these ideas in this book I'm writing on ecological civilization. I'm totally with you. Brilliant for bringing it into the conversation.
The corporation needs to evolve. Absolutely. Yeah. It's
so
okay.
Let's have if it's okay with you, Marjorie, if we just run over time just a little bit. Are you okay?
I'm good.
Okay, great. So maybe we can just have the next three, Jaya, Robert, and David. I see you there in line, and then we'll call hold then. I'm sorry if you're beyond there in the line. Do feel free to put questions. I'm going to upload this on video on the Deep Transformation Network. If you have other comments, please put it there, and we can see if we can ask Marjorie if she could respond there, or put them in the chat here too, so we can get them here. Jaya?
So how do you see it that it is the monetary incentive for every individual and as a complex on every kind of society in itself? This is in connection with modern industries, also in terms of weapons technology, that this is the deep core and real cause that set our planetary house on fire, that fuels the flames and does not let us as humanity fight against the catastrophe of self-annihilation. And what if the current multiple crises cannot be solved or rather managed and overcome within or maintaining the monetary system together with this inherent permanent monetary economic competition, together with the inherent permanent competitive situation for these means, which throughout the history has repeatedly led to military conflicts and wars. The last thing is, how do you see the factor that we in and of itself no longer need money or a monetary system, because there is a new means of organization, global networking, in connection with digitalization,
so it sounds like
which could replace the monetary system globally and simultaneously in one fell swoop within a very short preparation time.
So it sounds like you're asking primarily about the monetary system. Marjorie, if you want to say anything.
Sure. I don't get into the monetary system a lot in the book, and of course it's vital. It's huge. The one thing I do talk about, I tend to focus on institutional design, because I think institutions hold norms and hold theories in place. And I talk about the Cornell law professor who talks about we need a people's Fed, right? The Federal Reserve should not be serving the banks, the big banks who are the ones who sit on the board. It should be serving the people. And that's what it was designed to. And it should be enabling local economic development that creates broad-based wealth. So I think that is an example of an institutional design that can can direct the monetary system in a different kind of way. And one other thing I would say is we certainly need a lot of debt forgiveness. That the idea that these massive debts, particularly on developing nations, many of those need to be forgiven. We need a big debt jubilee.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for raising it. The monetary system clearly has been designed just like the entire capitalist system, just for the wealthy to maintain that wealth, and that has to be changed. So Robert and David, and then we'll close the questions at that point.
This is overwhelming. I'll be very brief. This is the best conversation I've had for a long time. And Margie's work is fantastic. And I keep running up against the dilemma of the fact that we are understanding more and more in the ways that we've been discussing here, and that we are at a kind of a critical emergency point in terms of climate and ecosystems as a result of all this. And my question then is, which I think is an underlying kind of elephant in the room thing, how can we mobilize enough people with that mindset that is necessary to have a sufficient political pressure to force institutions to change
Yeah.
rather than kind of waiting for the whole culture to change, which we don't have time for, essentially.
Yeah, it's a critical question, isn't it? And again, I think the idea that we need a more democratic economy, that we need fundamental change to our economy, I don't feel like that idea is ready for prime time in politics yet. I mean, I mentioned Elizabeth Warren. I mean, there are some ideas out there that I think can move this ahead. But I still think it's really important that we get together. Those of us who do get it, who are interested in it, who are understanding it, we need to connect and build the movement that then can become a political force. And I think we're not there yet. And I would encourage you, at the Democracy Collaborative, we have a free newsletter. Please sign up for it, democracycollaborative.org, and keep in touch with what I'm up to and what we're up to.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, thanks. And maybe just to turn to David Corton, and like I said, if your hand is still up, please put your question maybe in the chat. I'll upload it when I upload the recording so we can get that into the conversation and maybe get some answers. But let's finish with you, David. And wonderful to have you join us, David, one of the leading thinkers in this space for so many decades that I personally have learned just countless things from. Really great to have you here.
Well, it's been wonderful to join you. You two, of course, are among my list of current heroes, and very much carrying forward the conversation that some of us have been involved in for a very long time. I want to raise one bit of discomfort in terms of the discussion about, are we for or against capitalism? And I haven't heard any definition of capitalism. Whereas I think one of the things we haven't discussed with the depth that it requires is ownership is absolutely foundation to the issues of power that we are dealing with. And in very simple terms, capitalism is about ownership by billionaires. And socialism is about ownership by government. And at least by my understanding of life and how life organizes, how Earth organizes, and how we need to think and organize as an ecological civilization, the focus has to be on community. And basically that requires that we engage in this thinking about how do we get ownership into community. So it aligns with people in the place where they live. And
yeah,
I've got some, go ahead.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that instead of just focusing only on individual wealth, we want to focus on community wealth. And there's a variety of forms of wealth, as you have said. It's not just money, there's all kinds of forms of wealth. But yes, I think ownership is absolutely foundational. And you and I have both been talking about this for many years. Ownership, property, that's the foundation of what we're dealing with, and we need to transform it. And there, of course, there are a lot of models, community land trusts. We need municipal-owned electricity and water and so forth, and worker-owned businesses. So there's many forms of creating community ownership, and these are absolutely what we need to have a democratic economy. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and
it's fundamental to our question of how do we transform corporations. Essentially, I haven't figured out how to do it, but we've got to find some way to restructure the ownership.
Right.
With the cooperative principles of essentially one person, one vote.
And it's this core sense of the commonwealth that most of the wealth available to us in the world today is morally there for all of us to share. And so yes, I think that's fundamental. Thank you for closing us with that, David. And
Thank you, David.
And I do know, Marjorie, for people who have been in this conversation going, I've got to read this book, which I strongly recommend you do if you haven't already. I think you mentioned the publisher Berry Cola is offering a 30% discount on it. I think you said. So do you just want to give us the details of that real quick?
Yeah, my publisher, Barrett Kohler, very generously allows me to extend this 30% discount to friends. And we're all friends here. So go to bkconnection.com and to purchase my book, Wealth Supremacy. And at checkout, put in the code FRIENDS, FRIENDS, to get the 30% discount.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marjorie. And I really want to thank you so much for this conversation, which I've been itching to have with you for a while. And I'm so glad we can all have it together and share this. And for people who are still here, just wanted to give you a heads up. And if we can maybe spotlight Brian Sawa-Foner right now, that in 3 weeks from now, at our next Deep Transformation Network live monthly meeting, one of the ways in which we can sort of break out the trance is by basically honoring Indigenous wisdom.
Yes.
At our next live monthly meeting, Brian is going to be hosting a special session with 4 Indigenous elders from the Cree, Mohawk, Algonquin, and Maya nations. And so, Brian, if you just want to just spend a moment to tell us a little bit more about that, it'd be great to give people the heads up.
Well, thank you. I feel very honored to be hosting this next DTN live event. And the theme, as Jeremy mentioned, is ecological wisdom, traditional Indigenous ecological wisdom. And we'll be having conversations with these 4 Indigenous grandmothers from different nations. And we'll talk about their life stories, their practices, their teachings that have been passed on through generations in many cases, and then as well the initiatives that they're involved with today to unite Indigenous peoples of the Americas and also to reach out to the whole world with messages for humanity on what we need to do to come back into balance with nature.
Great. Thank you, Brian. So don't miss this session on June 4th. That's going to be just amazing to be able to be part of that. And just one more big thank you, Marjorie. This has been a great conversation. And I hope we'll get you here on the Deep Transformation Network more in the future as we move forward. So
that'd be great, Jeremy. Thanks so much for this. This was a really great discussion.
Really feel we've learned so much, and we can keep up the conversation on the DTN. I'll upload the recording, and the conversation is ongoing. Most of these questions need multiple.
Yeah, right. We may not have solved it all.
All right, take care. Look forward.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.